You may have wondered where this studio is that we've set up for this video. And I want to tell you just a little bit about that. But before I do, I want to remind you that there is some debate about when Moses actually lived. Did he live in the 1400s BC, and did the Exodus occur in the mid-1400s BC? Or did he live in the 1300s and the 1200s, and the Exodus occurred around 1280 BC? Most mainline scholars believe the latter, that Moses lived in the 1300s, the 1200s, the Exodus occurred around 1279 BC, or somewhere around that period of time. And during that time, a man named Ramses II was pharaoh in Egypt. Now, this is an exhibit at the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art, a traveling exhibit from Turin, Italy. And this is an exhibit of Ramses II's wife's tomb and the things that were found in her tomb. And so we are looking at the cover of the sarcophagus, the lid of the sarcophagus, for the wife of the Pharaoh when Moses led the children of Israel out of Egypt and to the Promised Land. I'm really excited to have a friend of mine, the director and CEO of the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art. He's responsible for this beautiful exhibit that's here, and he's going to be sharing with us a little bit about it. Julian Sukasagoitia. Julian, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for being here, and welcome to the Nelson Atkins.
Thanks. So tell us, we've seen bits and pieces of this so far. Tell us what we're seeing here.
So here we are really in the reconstruction of the chamber, the burial chamber of Nefertari. And this is part of a big exhibition that we brought to Kansas City, rendering homage to one of the greatest queens of ancient times. She's the beloved wife of Ramses II. And this tomb, and you see here some of the replicas of the bas-reliefs that are painted, is considered to be like the Sistine Chapel of Egyptian tombs, the most beautiful and the best preserved one that has been found in antiquities.
And she's buried in the Valley of the Kings or the Valley of the Queens?
She is buried in the Valley of the Queens, and so on the west side of the Nile. And that tomb, as long as many of the Valley of the Queens tombs were discovered in the early 1900s by an Italian delegation led by archaeologist called Schiaparelli.
And this exhibit is on loan from Turin, is that correct?
Exactly. This, of course, all the materials, and at the time, the Italian government, well, they gave permits to foreigners. They shared the discoveries of the tomb, and so all of this is normally housed in the Turin Museum of Egyptian Art.
And you've created this to scale, is that correct?
So this is 101, and here you have, for instance, the sarcophagus, the lid of the sarcophagus. This is pink granite, and you see it's a very hard stone, but the violence in antiquity to rob tombs, because they had treasures, of course, but also because they were trying also sometimes to obliterate the possibility of the spirit to continue living in these people. So you see the violence of this very few things were left in the tomb. The tomb in antiquities was robbed already, and very few objects remain.
Today we come to the third commandment, and as we do, we remember these words: do not use the name of the Lord your God as though it were of no significance. Now, often we just hear that as don't cuss, don't swear. And of course, this commandment would have some bearing on that, especially when we swear using God's name. When we say God's name or we say the word God and we don't mean anything by it, or we use it as an exclamation, something we're angry about or upset about, we're misusing the idea, the very idea and the very name or the word we use for God. But of course, the commandment had a lot more to say than just asking us not to speak in these ways using the name of God. It did, as you'll discover as you're reading the text, it did have something to do with the promises that we make. And so, we sometimes say, I've heard people say, I swear to God, and usually that's a way of saying, I'm telling the truth, I'm telling the truth. But what happens if you swear in God's name and you're not telling the truth? We're going to explore that just a little bit today. And then, of course, there are ways that we talk about God, things that we say about God or we attribute to God that are not consistent with the character of God. So I remember a woman I spoke to some years ago, and she had come to the church for the very first time. And I said, well, I'm so glad you're here. Tell me your story. And she said, well, I haven't been to church in a long time. I stopped going to church after my child died, and people told me it was the will of God. So when we attribute to God something like the death of a child, that God took this woman's child, and we say that that was God's will, God did that, we're saying something about God that may be inconsistent with the character of God and actually pushes people away from God. We can give God a bad name. Of course, in the end, what I'm going to suggest to you is that our very lives, how we live as Christians, as people of faith, how we live our lives, is meant to be a way of not just not dishonoring God or misusing God's name or using God's name as if it's of no significance, but instead that we are meant to live our lives in such a way that we give God a good name, that when people look at us and they know that we're Christians, they see a picture, a representation of the God who gives us life, who loves us. And so I'm going to encourage and challenge you as we explore this commandment to be ready to ask, am I a good representation of the name of God? Am I bearing God's name well? Let's talk about God's name and the command, do not use the Lord your God's name as if it were of no significance. First of all, how is that normally translated into English in the Tanakh?
Do not take God's name in vain.
Yeah, so that's the classical. That's what most of us memorized when we were growing up. So what does that mean?
Well, I think most people think that it means you don't curse using God's name. And I'd say that's correct, but I think it's much more than that. I believe when we do things in life in God's name that are not holy, that is taking God's name in vain. That is taking God's name as though it is of no significance, to use your translation. I think too often we act and speak in God's name when in fact we're speaking on our behalf, and we're using the power of God, that intimate relationship with God, in order to elevate ourselves. I believe that's when it becomes a sin, if you would.
Let's talk about, for a moment, the commandment also states that when we violate this commandment, God punishes to the fourth generation, something some call transgenerational retribution. What do you do with that?
I struggle with it. I struggle with it because I don't want to believe that things that I do, my children, my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren will suffer as a result of that. However, there's a truth to it. Mm-hmm. We are in the midst of destroying our planet through climate change that is human-based. There's no question in my mind that our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren will suffer as a result of what we've done. When we act in ways that cause irreparable damage to relationships, to the world, to communities, I do believe that those who come after us, in fact, suffer the pain of knowing that we've created those problems in the world. So I think that it doesn't happen, but I struggle with the idea that they have to suffer because we've done something wrong.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I also think what troubles me a little bit in the language, because that's in my mind, you can't argue with the fact that there is pain that comes from the sins of the fathers and mothers that are visited upon their great-great-grandchildren. For me, the question is, did we create this pain that's passed on, or is God punishing my great-great-grandchildren for a sin that I've committed? And I want to back away from this being God's punishment and instead it being the consequences of our bad moral judgment or, our behavior that has violated God's world and that's passed on. Do you?
I would agree with that, and I take some comfort in the other side of that, because it says that the sins of the fathers and the mothers, if you would, are passed on to the third and fourth generation, but the blessings that we create extend to the 1000th generation.
Right.
And I'd like to believe that the way we behave in the world, when we do good, it redounds to the benefit of so many more generations than the evils that we do.
Yeah. So in some sense, hyperbole on both sides, maybe.
Absolutely.
And good. All right. I want to close by simply inviting you to remember the commandment is about not only not misusing God's name, but the backside, the positive thou shalt, is let's live our lives in such a way as people of faith that we represent God's name and use God's name well, that when people see us, they might catch a glimpse of the God who loves them.